Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another Friday Discovery session. For those that don't know me, I'm Natalie Irwin, Director of Stakeholder Engagement here at Efficiency Canada. And I actually wanted to take this opportunity to thank everyone who donated for Giving Tuesday this week. We really appreciate your support, especially during these uncertain times. And so also a special thank you to Carleton University for matching funds donated on Tuesday, December 1st as part of Giving Tuesday. So thank you again. We really appreciate it. So now for the next 45 minutes, sit back and enjoy learning as we listen to our presenter, Justin, here today. And I hope you can take part in the Q&A after he presents for the first 20 minutes. We usually have enough time to get to all of our questions. And on that note, for those that are joining us for the first time, we do ask you to save your questions until the end. You can hit the little bottom box on the Zoom call there, and the Q&A box will pop up, or you can raise your hand and I can unmute you and you can ask your own questions. So let's get started. So please join me in welcoming Justin Egger, renewable natural gas specialist with Enbridge, who is going to share information on renewable natural gas. So we'll find out how this sustainable and resilient energy source will be part of Canada's clean energy future and how it relates to energy efficiency. So welcome, Justin. Thank you for joining us today, and thanks for your festive background you have in here today.
Thanks so much, Natalie. Appreciate it. And thanks so much for this opportunity to talk on RNG. I hope this session will be beneficial to those listening and give you a bit more insight on RNG. There's been a lot in the news recently on low carbon energy, renewable natural gas, hydrogen, solar. So hopefully this will give you a bit of a glimpse into the renewable natural gas perspective of those low carbon energy sources. So as Natalie mentioned, my name is Justin Egan. From Enbridge Gas Inc. And I'm located here in southwestern Ontario, where we have a group that's been working on developing the renewable natural gas market, not just in Ontario, but really across Canada. We have groups down in the US as well that are focusing on RNG development in the US. And there's some really great things coming from not just the market itself, but everybody else that contributes into the markets. It's been a really great project to see this develop over the years. So I'm going to start with an overview of RNG, how it's generated, what it actually is. I'm going to jump into kind of what the markets look like, what's driving the market, business policies, regulatory policies. I'm going to do a bit of an energy comparison as well. So I mentioned low carbon energies. There's lots going on right now: hydrogen, renewable natural gas, solar. How do all these compare together? And then I'm going to talk a bit about some of the projects that we're working on. It's not just us working on renewable natural gas. There's quite a few other parties working on RNG, and the collaborative success in the sector has been really amazing to see. So I'm going to start with a quote from our CEO. As I mentioned, there's been a lot in the news recently about not just RNG, but those other low carbon energy sources. But there's been a recent shift in focus to really start to look at how we can develop alternative energies in this future of low carbon, in this future of our low carbon economy. So there's been a shift to really start to capture some of those low carbon energy sources and then begin to utilize them as clean sources of energy to meet emissions targets and ultimately benefit our environment. So there has been a focus, at least at Enbridge, to pour more investment and time into developing the sector, and we're really excited about it. So renewable natural gas comes ultimately from organic sources of waste. So this can be anything from like your food processing waste. So this could be like your food processors and things like that. There could be waste products from them. You have agricultural waste like dairy manure. You have some crop waste. you have a biosolid waste, which would be like that sludge from wastewater treatment plants. And then you have landfill gas as well. So that would be gas that's naturally produced at landfills. You may have seen this gas flared off in the past from certain landfills. So ultimately, waste is collected and it's put through an anaerobic digester. And what that is basically a giant tank where decomposition of these organics happen in an anaerobic environment. So an anaerobic environment is one that doesn't contain any oxygen. So when you have organic decomposition in an anaerobic environment, you get both methane and CO2 that are created. So the methane is what we really want to capture and use for energy. So typically this ratio is about 60% methane and about 40% CO2. So that raw, what we call biogas, can be used to run engines, create electricity, or we can run it through what's called an upgrading process or a scrubbing process. And we clean up that RNG or clean up that biogas and create RNG, which would be like pipeline quality natural gas. So now we have this clean energy source that can be put into the pipeline, be used to heat homes, to cook, to fuel fleets. There's a variety of uses that RNG can be used for, the same as you use traditional natural gas for. But now it's being derived from organic sources of, in this case, waste. So you might be familiar with composting, where you take your organics, from your kitchen, you might throw them into your composter at home, and eventually those organics break down, and you have compost at the end, and you spread that compost through your gardens, and ultimately it's good fertilizer for your garden. So composting is digestion that happens in an aerobic environment. So ultimately, those organics that you put into your composter break down and produce only carbon dioxide, and then you spread that compost in your gardens. Similarly, you have a byproduct from the anaerobic digestion process called digestate. So you take the digestate and you can spread that across your gardens, across your agricultural fields, the same as you do compost at your home. So you get this full cycle where you have a waste product, an organic waste product, that's decomposed. You capture the energy, the methane that's created from the decomposition, and then you take the byproduct, the digestate, and you do something with it and return the nutrients back into the soil. So you kind of see this full circular process of waste to energy. Landfills are very similar in that landfills are really just like an anaerobic digester that's happening underground. So again, that landfill gas is produced in an anaerobic environment. It can be cleaned up and used in the same applications that you can use traditional natural gas. So that's a bit of an overview of renewable natural gas. The key takeaway is that it can be used in the same way that traditional natural gas can be used, whether in compressed type application like fleet vehicles, or in your home for cooking or heating, or industrial processes for their applications as well. Same application as natural gas without any upgraded infrastructure at all. So traditionally, there are 4 target markets that really we're looking at waste coming from, and for application of renewable natural gas as well. So first I want to talk about municipalities. Municipalities are in a unique position in that they're collecting waste, usually with their refuse fleet. They're doing something with the waste. So a lot of large municipalities might have their own digesters that are creating biogas. Sometimes it's being flared off, so it might just be being burned right now. But if we could do something with that biogas, like clean it up and turn it to RNG, then it can be put back into the refuse fleet. It can be, the municipality can burn it for fuel to heat their own buildings. They can sell it into the market as a revenue stream. several different applications, but municipalities are unique in that they can be both an RNG producer and an RNG user. And once you start really putting this into your energy mix, you start to capture some very strong environmental benefits. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Food and beverage processors or the industrial commercial type production facilities, again, they can be both a producer and a user of RNG. So they might have a large amount of waste product from their own processes, and they could put that back in their energy mix, use it, capture those strong environmental benefits, or sell into the market. Same for waste management companies. They might own landfills. They could be producing landfill gas, be turning it into RNG, and then doing something with it, like powering their fleets or selling into the market. Agribusinesses are a unique situation because you have these businesses like farmers that have this large amount of agricultural land where they can put a lot of this infrastructure in place and create a new revenue source for themselves. So a prime example of this is a dairy farmer. So a dairy farmer has their cows in a large enclosed facility where that facility is collecting its manure, those dairy cow manure, and they have to do something with it. And so because manure is within the industry a very low carbon product, the renewable natural gas that's developed from dairy manure waste is extremely low carbon. You start to see prime examples of this, like in California, where you have these massive dairy operations that are capturing the waste and producing renewable natural gas, and you have very low, what's called carbon intensity gas. And so it's a very desirable form of gas because it ultimately has a negative emissions profile when it's burned because of the type of waste that goes into producing it. So I touch a bit on some of the advantages that RNG has. You kind of start to see the circular economy approach that happens when you're turning what was a waste product into a source of clean energy. And you're starting to see this full circle of waste to energy. So something that was ultimately not used for anything is now used as a clean source of energy. This begins to reduce greenhouse gas emissions significantly because you're taking waste, you're using that waste for something, and as a result, when you burn the renewable natural gas that's produced, you have with renewable natural gas either very near zero emissions or less than zero emissions, and that's where you might start to hear the terms like low carbon or net zero or similar terms like that. Now, the advantage with renewable natural gas, a large advantage, is that it utilizes the existing pipeline infrastructure network. So you have this underground network that already exists, and when you start to create RNG and inject it into the network, users now begin to reap the benefits, the greenhouse gas emission reduction benefits, by tapping into our energy network. And most of us are already attached to the pipeline network. So when you start to blend renewable natural gas in with your fuel mix, you begin to see those benefits, those very strong benefits of greenhouse gas reductions. Now, because it's using the existing pipeline infrastructure network, you have strong resiliency. So you get natural disasters that come in and knock out power lines and things like that. Very rarely will you ever see the gas shut off as a result of a natural disaster. So you have a very consistent, very resilient, very strong energy source that you know is going to be consistent and you know is going to be a very clean source of energy. We'll talk about cost shortly, but you start to see how utilizing energy or renewable natural gas as your energy source not only is reducing your emissions significantly, but it's also starting to manage your cost. So we'll get into cost shortly here. The CGA did some analysis on this, and they said that currently there's about 7 PJs of gas, of renewable natural gas, being generated. So to put that in perspective, that's about 7 million gigajoules of gas that's currently being produced, at least back in 2017, and the average residential user uses just under 100 gigajoules of natural gas per year, to give you some basis. With the potential that Canada has to produce renewable natural gas, and the waste that it currently has and has been calculated, there's the potential to fill 36% of our pipelines with renewable natural gas, with the amount of waste that we currently have. That is a massive number. It's once you start blending, and we'll talk more about the GHG benefits shortly, but once you start blending renewable natural gas into your energy source, you start to reap very strong environmental benefits. You've probably heard in the news about municipalities declaring climate emergencies. There's actions that need to be done now to address those climate emergencies that have been declared. And one of those is reducing your carbon footprint. By blending renewable natural gas into your energy mix, you are significantly reducing your carbon footprint without an increase in infrastructure capital costs if you have natural gas infrastructure in place already. This differs quite a bit when you start looking at electrifying everything. We'll get into that shortly. But the potential for generating renewable natural gas in Canada is huge. There's a few different policy drivers that are really driving the market. One of them is Ontario's food and waste policy, which basically states that by a certain date, landfills will not accept organics anymore. That means the organics have to go somewhere else. And that somewhere else is going to be in places like anaerobic digesters. So we start to see an increase in renewable natural gas that way. There's also the federal carbon tax that's currently in play, and you may have seen at the gas pump a bit of a sliding scale. Go to the next slide here. A bit of a sliding scale that maybe looks similar to this. So you see an increase in the price of carbon over time. So what does that mean with respect to renewable natural gas? So because RNG is net carbon or less than or has less than zero carbon, ultimately you could take a production facility that is a large emitter. So you might have like a steel facility that will just have a lot of emissions from its normal operations. And without a increase in some sort of change in their facility, they're always going to have a lot of emissions. If you start blending RNG that has negative emissions and you add it to their positive emissions, you're bringing down their total emissions. So that, in essence, decreases the amount of carbon tax that they need to pay. So that's a huge driver for RNG. You also saw on the last slide that I listed the federal clean fuel standard. So this is something that's going to come to play in the next couple of years, where it sort of works similar to if you've heard cap and trade in the past. And that's, again, it's very similar to you're creating emissions and you need some sort of something else to offset your emissions. And that's how RNG comes into play as well, because of its significantly low emissions profile. So you might think to yourself, what's really enabling the market to do this? And at least in Ontario, we have what's called the Ontario Energy Board, basically the regulator for the utility that allows us to do different actions. And you have different regulatory boards across Canada, depending on the province you're in. At least in Ontario, we as a utility gained approval back a few years ago to begin looking at and investing into alternative energy sources, RNG being one of them. And then very recently, we just received approval to begin a voluntary RNG program, which basically the customer can voluntarily elect to have RNG mixed into their energy portfolio. FortisBC in British Columbia, they've been doing the voluntary RNG program for a few years now, and it's been working very well for them. So these are ways to really start to create demand within the market, within the residential market, and really start to drive demand for RNG. So I chatted a bit about electrification, but when you start to compare RNG versus electrification, you start to see the strong resiliency that occurs with blending renewable natural gas in your energy mix. So with net zero emissions, we chatted about that because RNG is coming from organic waste. It has near zero emissions or less, most likely less than zero emissions. Now, fortunately, in Ontario, our electricity is relatively clean, but with RNG, you're significantly reducing your emissions by blending it or just using it as 100% energy in your energy portfolio. When you start talking about service interruptions and natural disasters and things like that, the gas pipeline is always going to be a very resilient source of energy. And then when you start talking about peak demand as well, if there's a large increase in electrifying everything, you're going to start to see an increase in peak demand. With natural gas and the existing pipeline infrastructure that's in place, you don't have a peak demand like that. So in addition to its resiliency, you have cost management as well, and we'll talk about that on the next slide here. So very interestingly, in Ontario, we're currently paying 12.8 cents per kilowatt hour for our electricity. Now, you may have wondered so far what the cost of RNG is. So the market currently says that RNG is valued somewhere between $20 to $30 a GJ. So it's pretty safe to say RNG is, we can say 24 bucks a GJ. If we value RNG at $24 a GJ, that is equivalent to 9 cents per kilowatt hour, which is cheaper than our current Ontario electricity rate of 12.8 cents per kilowatt hour. And you can see the energy cost comparison there. So we know that natural gas is a very affordable and clean source of energy. At a delivered cost of $4 to $5 a GJ, that's an extremely affordable and clean source of energy. When we start comparing like RNG versus electricity, so again, if we value it at $24 a GJ, it is still cheaper than electricity. And again, if you're looking at electrifying everything in your production facility, so if we take like a municipality that wants to electrify everything, they're going to have to purchase electric fleet vehicles, which are extremely expensive. They're going to have to upgrade their charging infrastructure because most likely it doesn't exist if they're buying electric fleet vehicles. They're going to have to replace their heating infrastructure. Most likely they have boilers or gas-fired furnaces, extremely expensive and high capital cost. But with all the existing infrastructure that one may have in place, gas-fired furnaces, maybe you have compressed natural gas fueling infrastructure in place, by now utilizing RNG, you don't have to change any of that infrastructure at all. So there's no high capital cost up front. Instead, you're just blending RNG or just using RNG straight up, and you're reaping those environmental benefits, those greenhouse gas reduction savings immediately. So it's a strong case when you're comparing RNG versus electricity. Even only as a solely as a commodity, you start to see the strong cost comparison between RNG and electricity. I've listed just a few of our projects that we've done up to date. We're working on several different projects, and we've partnered with Toronto for their anaerobic digesters, and that's a fantastic success story. They're going to be blending fuel into their fleets, and when you start to blend it to transportation, you really see such a strong savings in greenhouse gas reductions and your carbon footprint reductions as well. Niagara, you may have seen this in the news as well, about the work that we've done with Niagara and the landfill there. Very recently, there's an anaerobic digester in London that we've partnered with and are going to be producing renewable natural gas there. The Hamilton wastewater treatment plant has been producing renewable natural gas for quite a few years now. That's a great success story as well. They have a large fleet of buses there that's been running compressed natural gas. And again, when you start blending RNG into your energy mix, even for transportation, you really start to see the significant greenhouse gas reduction savings. That's it for me. Thank you so much for your attention. I'm open to any questions that you guys may have.
Thanks so much, Justin. Oh, sorry, I'm getting feedback. That was very informative. I, for one, only knew a little bit about renewable natural gas, so it was great to learn more. I know other people felt the same way because there are already people asking Q&A questions throughout your presentation. So just a reminder, you can raise your hand and I can unmute you and you can ask your question, or you can type your question in the Q&A box and essentially I will narrate it for you. We'll start with an easy one first. Let's see here. What was the waste feedstocks considered when calculating Canada's RNG potential?
Sorry, what are the waste feedstocks considered?
Yeah.
Okay, so really this would be any sort of organic waste. And when you start getting more into like the technical details, certain types of waste have lower carbon impacts than other waste. So I mentioned like dairy manure has the lowest carbon impact when you begin to use it as a feedstock. Whereas something like a landfill's carbon impact is a bit higher on the scale than a dairy manure carbon impact. They're still both extremely low, like a landfill is still extremely low from a carbon perspective. But yeah, there are charts out there that really describe where certain feedstocks land with respect to carbon impact. But really these are organics that you're talking about. So like maybe green bin waste, food waste, agricultural manure type waste, wastewater treatment plant sludge type waste. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, well, I think so. Another question here is, how can industrials have clients have access to these RNG if they're interested?
Okay, yeah, that's a great question. So there's a few different ways to approach it, especially as an industrial operation. So one, of course, is put new infrastructure onto your facility and begin capturing your own waste, or maybe co-digesting waste from nearby facilities and beginning producing your own biogas, cleaning it up, putting it into the grid, or burning it yourself. There's that perspective. There's also the perspective, which probably a lot of people land in, which is purchasing renewable gas from somewhere. So there are energy marketers out there, or gas marketers they're called, that are purchasing RNG from other sources, like maybe across Canada or across the US. And they can purchase RNG for you. And then ultimately, it's happening really on paper, but ultimately they're attributing those environmental attributes to you as an industrial user. So just for some background, the gas sector kind of works on a volumetric basis. So similar to Like if you were to deposit cash into an ATM here in Ontario and flew out to Vancouver and pulled out your money out of an ATM there, you're not pulling out the exact dollars, the exact bills that you put into the machine in Ontario. It's similar in the gas industry. So there could be renewable natural gas that's deposited into the gas infrastructure somewhere. We'll say maybe like British Columbia, and maybe you in Ontario purchase renewable natural gas for your own application, but it's not the actual molecule that you're burning. You're reaping the what's called the environmental attributes of that gas as a user in Ontario.
Thanks for that. I do have another question here actually from Matthew. It's a bit of a long one, but I'm going to try and shorten it here. So what are the contents of the gases from municipal waste anaerobic digestion that need to be removed before the gas is considered quote unquote clean? And
Okay.
how exactly is it cleaned, and how energy intensive is the cleaning process?
Okay, yeah, no, those are great questions. So we'll start with the first one. So if you're creating gas from a municipality, usually you have a few different constituents within the gas. So you have, of course, your two main ones, which are CO2 and methane. The methane is the energy source, but then you might have some other things too. So there's one constituent that's called siloxanes. So this is derived from things like you have like shampoos and lipsticks and things like that that you might find within wastewater that might show up at a municipal digester. So if you have to take a shower, wash hair with shampoo, and you kind of get that slimy or the Teflon-y or silicone-y feel in your hands. That's kind of where these things called siloxanes come from. Now, when you start to clean gas that has siloxanes in it, you can start to gum up your equipment. And I'll talk about that shortly. But you start to have other things like there's something called terpenes. There's a lot of different chemical names for a lot of these different constituents that could be within the gas. But ultimately, it's CO2, methane, and you might have a bit of other small constituents in the gas. But when you start to, and I should mention hydrogen sulfide too, which can be scrubbed out of gas. So you start to have these gas constituents that are created and run through the upgrading process, as we call it. So this is some sort of technology that is separating out the methane from everything else. So usually you have the gas would go through like a carbon scrubber first, which removes the hydrogen sulfide, and then the gas goes through some other process that then begins to drop out the carbon dioxide, the moisture, and things like that. So there's a bunch of different technologies that do that. There's like a membrane type technology that it's kind of works like maybe your vacuum, where you have like a filter and air is forced through the filter, and then that filter captures the components that you don't want and releases the rest of the air. That's kind of like a membrane type system. You have gas that's forced through these membranes. You have like a pressure swing absorption system, which is like a very resilient system that can handle a lot of different types of gas qualities. That's more of like a mechanical type system. So you have a lot of these different types of technology that'll clean the gas, but ultimately at the end of the day, these technologies are really taking a lot of these very different constituents that are in the gas and dropping them out, keeping the methane usually in the 98 to over 99% range, and then doing something with that methane or the renewable natural gas. Good question.
Yeah, we had a bit of a science lesson there.
Yeah.
So just on that note, what is the anticipated relative costs of renewable natural gas versus standard natural gas? Do you know that
Okay.
yet?
Yeah, no, I'll go back to, if you can still see my screen there.
Yep.
So a delivered, at least here in Ontario, a delivered cost of natural gas is usually between $4 to $5 per gigajoule. RNG, the market says that the RNG molecule is worth somewhere like $20 to $30 per GJ. There's a lot of variables in there, but it's pretty safe to say RNG can land somewhere in the middle there. That's why it's so interesting when you think about RNG being valued at $24 a GJ. That's equivalent to 9 cents per kilowatt hour, which in Ontario right now is cheaper than electricity. Yeah.
Perfect. A question here from Andy is he's curious about the difference of GHG emissions as compared to the use of regular natural gas on fuel appliances. You touched on that a little, but the next question he has here is, will there be any kind of equipment upgrades needed?
Right. Yeah, very important. Yeah, good question. So traditional natural gas, if we jump into like the units of carbon, usually these emissions are measured on what's called like grams of CO2 emissions per megajoule. So that's really technical, but basically if you take like traditional natural gas, which I think is around like positive, I want to say positive 40 or something like that. It's lower on in the carbon emissions. I think it's somewhere around positive 40 or something like that. And then you start getting to renewable natural gas, which is like could be as low as like minus 250. So that's a huge swing where a lot of RNG sources might land somewhere in the like minus 150 mark or so. So you start to see the vast swing in emissions. And then when you start to look at equipment like your natural gas stove or your furnace at your home, because of the very strict pipeline quality requirements that we have, and I know lots of other utilities have, there is no change at all to your any infrastructure that you might have already. Yeah, exactly. So you could burn 100% RNG at your home and not see any change, nor do you need to change any of your appliances.
Well, that's good news for consumers for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
A question here from Brendan is, what is the role of renewable natural gas in a net zero emissions economy? So essentially with 100% renewable energy systems, either through fuel or through electricity.
Yeah, so when we start to think about like low carbon emissions and things like that, it's really where is the energy coming from in order to make something low carbon or net zero carbon. So like you might have seen electric vehicles. It said that electric vehicles no emissions at all. Well, there are emissions coming from the electricity grid. The electricity grid's used to fuel your electric car. So ultimately, the carbon intensity or the carbon score for your electric car is whatever the carbon intensity is of electricity. The same is for like, let's say your gas stove or a municipal energy requirement. So wherever the source of that energy is coming from, that is what those emissions are for your facility or for your home. So when you start to think of like net zero or zero emissions society, it's where that energy is coming from. So either if you're blending in RNG or using RNG, or forget even about RNG, think about solar or hydrogen or anything where your energy is coming from. That is where how you score or gauge the emissions. So when you start blending RNG into your energy portfolio or just using it straight up, like in vehicles or something like that, then you start to see your emissions drop significantly. I hope that answered the question.
I think so. Brendan, if you want to raise your hand, if the question hasn't been answered,
Yeah,
and you can
it's
clarify.
a bit of a convoluted answer.
Yeah, I know, like with BC, for example, their grid is for electricity at least is 95% renewable, so the emissions would be down. And you mentioned EVs with electric vehicles in BC because there's a big push there. Their
Hmm.
production for an EV is the emissions are worth or I guess responsible for 46% of the emissions for electric vehicles. So I know there's a question here and I can't find it, but there was a question on RNG productions, the emissions around productions.
Right.
Do you know anything about that, or can you speak to that?
Yeah. Yeah. No. Yeah. For sure. So normally when you have gas that is analyzed and and ultimately the gas gets a score attached to it. So you have these third parties that take a look at the entire process. So the trucking, if there's trucking associated with it, the compression, if that's part of the operation, the generation, the waste. You take all these factors in together, and ultimately you get some score wherever that what's called carbon intensity lands. So when these organizations, when they score your gas, they are looking at the entire picture. So the production of RNG as well. And so even with the production of RNG, you still see these very low carbon intensities, near zero, usually less than zero net carbon emissions.
That's great. I think there's a related question that's been quite popular. A number of people have liked it. You kind of touched on it a bit. I just want to make sure that in case you want to add anything, so I'm going to ask it.
Mhm.
Jason here is when you say RNG is near zero emission, do you mean compared to letting the waste just digest normally, or RNG when used for heating or when in an engine still produces emissions equivalent to natural gas?
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so that's really good. So you touch on a point there that's really important. So if you have a waste that just decomposes naturally, so let's take an apple that you just leave out in your yard naturally, it will naturally decompose, and because it's in an aerobic environment, CO2 is just generated. But let's take like a landfill, where you have these gases being produced at landfill, and usually they're collected and burned or do something else with it, like create RNG. But you could have a lot of this methane that's actually escaping into the atmosphere, which methane is very detrimental to the atmosphere. So if you're able to capture the methane and then do something with it, like create an energy source, well, that's a fantastic thing. Um, so so that's a awesome thing about RNG, is that you're capturing those potential methane emissions, and then doing something with it. So that's kind of where the less than zero or near zero emissions come in. When I say near zero, it's because depending on what the feedstock is, what that waste is, what the processes are that go into creating RNG, you might have a gas that's maybe not minus 150, but maybe you have a gas that's like minus 10 or maybe plus 5 or somewhere closer to zero, depending on what all the other factors are that go into making it.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Just one last questions because I'm just cautious of the time. I know there are a lot
Sure.
of questions. There's a lot of questions and a lot of interest here.
That's
Um, so
awesome.
so I will say that if anyone has follow-up questions, you can email Justin or you can email myself or info@efficiencycanada.org,
Sure.
and we will pass along your questions to Justin to answer. So just like I said, one last one here is how does Enbridge see RNG strategy linked with demand side management
Sorry,
or
can you
energy?
say that one more time?
How does Enbridge see renewable natural gas linked with demand side management?
Hey, yeah, that's a really important one. That's been coming up a lot recently. So we have a lot of demand side management programs with the utility. And if you don't know what DSM programs are, it's basically programs that the utility and this kind of sounds counterintuitive, but the utility really actually wants you to figure out ways to use less gas. So are there ways to create some sort of efficiency within your home or business or something like that so that you use less energy? Well, really, RNG is a perfect fit when you're considering DSM opportunities, because without doing, and so assuming that you have natural gas infrastructure in place, and without doing any upgrades, like capital upgrades at all to your facility, you can just buy RNG from somewhere, blend it into your energy mix, and now ultimately you've reduced your emissions or reduced your energy consumption, or that's a bit convoluted to say, really ultimately reduce your emissions, which is a demand side management opportunity. So we've had some industrials recently that we've chatted with that are just looking to reduce their own emissions, but also capitalize on the demand side management opportunities that we as a utility are offering. So yeah, definitely RNG is a DSM opportunity if you're considering that, for sure.
Awesome. Thanks for that. I know a lot of our listeners being involved in energy efficiency were interested in that answer. And like I said, there's a lot of questions here. And actually, Zana, I noticed you said that maybe have another public session so we can hear all the answers versus reaching out. So I'm actually going to go back, Justin. I'll ask you, but I'll reach out to the marketing person at Enbridge as well and see if this is something that Enbridge would be interested in hosting, and we can share with everyone to let them know when Enbridge hosts maybe like a Q&A
Yeah, for sure. I
for
think that's a great idea.
yeah, for renewable natural gas. Like I'm telling you, this is the longest list of questions we've seen.
Oh, awesome.
So there's a lot of interest there. But on that note, just because I'm cautious of the time and everyone getting back to their day. So thank you again, Justin. I really
For sure.
appreciate you joining us today and for the great conversation and for the audience for all the questions here today. Just so next week, I'm going to be joined actually by two of my former colleagues at Efficiency One, who is going to share how they've been exploring the use of virtual home assessments for lead generation on their home energy efficiency program. So they're actually looking at substituting the traditional energy guide assessment with a remote audit. So by having the energy advisor use a video call to do the audit and walk through the home with the homeowner. So I know there's been a lot of interest. So I'm expecting a lot of questions next week as well. So again, thanks everyone for joining and have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you so much, Natalie.